Hello. I've been told StreamYard gave me a pro tip before going live today that I should greet people watching the replay. So, hello. They didn't tell me about how to deal with this cough that suddenly emerged. Hello if you're watching a replay, or hello if you're watching live. It's the second episode of the Classics Reading Room. Mm. 1 second. Yes, this is the Classics Reading Room. Last time we looked at Tower of the Elephant by Robert Jordan. I did this last time. Robert E. Howard, the first great Conan story in many people's opinions. Yes, I am in the UK. I kind of tend to sleep like a 3 till 10, 3 till 9 schedule, depending on what I'm doing. So it's late, but it's just running up to bedtime for me. Yes, so today we will be reading. I took a bit of a mini vote in a community post, and I had 6 or 7 people respond, not a million people. One day. Hey, Matthew. And I think what we had was 2 votes for Woolf, 2 votes for Russell Kirk, 1 vote for H.P. Lovecraft, 1 vote for J.R.R. Tolkien, and we had a tiebreaker second vote, kind of second choice for Russell Kirk, who was who died, was it 95, 96? No, not 95, 96 perhaps. 1919 to 1994. Eminent literary and social critic who rose to national prominence in 1953 with the publication of his book, The Conservative Mind. The founding editor of Modern Age and the University Bookman, he wrote more than 30 books, including his memoirs, The Sword of Imagination. The Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal in Mecosta, Michigan, continues his work, hosting seminars, writers, and research scholars at Piety Hill, Kirk's ancestral home. Yeah, Roy, you were. It seemed like a good choice to put in there because there's a lot of stuff that is readable. Because one thing with short story choices is that obviously you can end up with stuff that's just too short, or stuff that's too long, and some authors don't have loads in between. And I think I was actually thinking this it certainly struck me to do with Howard, but I think you can also see it a bit with Woolf. I think Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories is actually one of the relatively few that matches like I want to be reading for 45 minutes to an hour or something. Otherwise, I think stuff gets too long. And I think Lovecraft has a good number of, not flash fiction, but short fiction that you can use, that you can rely on. So yeah, Kirk wrote this recommended. Front cover blurb is Bradbury. Russell Kirk deserves to be considered a fine writer and an amazing thinker in literature and in politics. And Madeleine L'Engle. Russell Kirk is a compelling storyteller. I read at a time when contemporary fiction sadly lacks a sense of story. I read all of his tales with enormous pleasure and a most willing suspension of disbelief. It's also refreshing to find stories of heavenly and profane love which deal with the grand theological themes. And T.S. Eliot, in a letter to Kirk, said, "How amazingly versatile and prolific you are. Now you've written what I should have least expected of you, ghost stories." He was seen by Eliot, actually, in Eliot's own life, as the one critic, or maybe one of the very few critics who really got him. He wrote an important book on Eliot called T.S. Eliot and His Age. So many hats, particularly literary critic and I suppose philosopher. I don't think I've got rogues, but got both Legends and at least half of Warriors, which are all Robert Silverberg, which is a similar principle to Rogues, of like long short stories, short novellas, which is where actually I first came to read a lot of authors, because I got half of Legends 1 when they're published in 2 separate paperback editions. And in that, I had Along with Terry Pratchett, for which the book was bought for me, which is short story, or is really a very long short story rather than a short novella. But I also read The Hedge Knight by George R. R. Martin, which I think we discussed recently, Matthew, on, well, some time ago, perhaps a couple of months actually, I say, on the Discord. I might have mentioned that Dunk and Egg is, I think, more or less Martin's best stuff. I also read some Tad Williams, and I'm hoping to start Memory Sorrowthorn this year. And the short story, The Burning Man, was for that, and I remember enjoying it. I don't necessarily remember the other stuff that was in the particular collection. Oh, Runner of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, the first Pern story I ever read, and I'm hoping to read the second trilogy from Pern this year as well. So yeah, Kirk, an interesting philosopher, literary critic, cultural critic, very broad, interested in lots of different things. One of his lesser known hats is, or was, as a ghost author, a ghost story author, a ghost author. I have done a review of this, Ancestral Shadows, which is virtually all of his short stories. I think there are 2 that aren't in here. And I've also reviewed Lord of the Shallow Dark. Obviously, this cough is a parasite worming its way into my brain. Lord of the Hollow Dark, which is arguably it's the last thing you should read of his, at least after the short stories, because it's the sort of culmination of his literary universe. There is a thing in which he ties together different strands of ghost stories into a really, on the whole, very satisfying conclusion. He's not simply an all-time writer in terms of like, oh, well, he has the grace of a Tom Wolfe and the humor of a Terry Pratchett and anything like that. He's more a very good at capturing the essence of the ghost story, which is, I think, to do with it's not strictly horror. Horror can have moral themes, but I think the ghost story particularly is the idea of something which isn't so much about what is seen and the sort of the subversion of safety, and more the idea of the strange entering into our life. It's closer to actually Lovecraft, but the ghost story in the hands of an M.R. James or Russell Kirk has a much more pensive and moral aspect. I'll put it up somewhere on I could put up in a community post actually, maybe, but if Matthew, if you could get the Discord link and capture it and drop it in the chat, that'd be helpful, because Matthew definitely is on the Discord. So what I'm going to try to read, I'll read at least one story. It's hard to pick. There's a couple of, basically, there's sub arcs of particular characters, or that touch on particular characters, and I think it's good. It's potentially good to start with the start of the first one in a particular line or a particular character where we're following them. But it's kind of hard to pick necessarily what. There's a good story called Uncle Isaiah. Some of these you can find, like there's a particular copy online, on a website, like I think maybe Imaginative Conservative has one, for instance, which was a website founded in the Kirkian tradition. It's a magazine, online magazine. But yeah, the Uncle Isaiah is pretty good as a place to start. That a lot of people quite like The Princess of All Lands, The Invasion of the Church of the Holy Ghost. Some of those are longer than I'd be up for reading. Invasion of the Church of the Holy Ghost is 42 pages, so probably an hour and 10, hour and 20. But what I'll read we'll read Saworth Place, and if we've got time, an encounter by Mortstone Pond. Saworth Place, and then, as I say, if we have time, an encounter by Mortstone Pond. So, I'll get started and hope my voice or my throat holds out. Obviously, it's in a bad mood. Saworth Place by Russell Kirk. The epigraph. But the age of chivalry is gone, the unbought grace of life, the cheap defence of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise is gone. It is gone, that sensibility of principle, that chastity of honour which felt a stain like a wound, which inspired courage whilst it mitigated ferocity, which ennobled whatever it touched, and under which vice itself lost half its evil by losing all its grossness. Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. In defiance of a faint ancient charm that perfumes its name, Saworth today is a dirty and dreary little town, fouled by the colliery since the pit was sunk and a blot of hideous industrial workers' houses began to spread about it. The lanes are half derelict now that the pit approaches exhaustion. At a turn of the High Street, or down close off the back Vennel, some fragments of old Scots masonry stand yet amidst a welter of hoardings and fish restaurants and corrugated iron roofing. To damp Saworth, of all places, Mr. Ralph Bain, M.C., had contrived to drift at the end of a month of purposeless nights in family and commercial hotels or bare village taverns across 3 counties. Drinks with strangers in one village, listless games of cards in the next town, inconsequential talks on buses or trains, dull glimpses of a pleasant wood there or an old church here. Thus February had run out, and the neat little pension cheque would be forwarded to him at Saworth, which spot he had chosen at random as his address for the first few days of March. Bain lounged by the door of the King's Arms in his old tweeds, with the cigarette burns neatly darned, and felt the crack in his skull more vexatious than usual, and shifted his long legs languidly. Saworth had nothing to show him, but what place had? He lit a cigarette, though he already had smoked 3 more this morning than he once resolved to allow himself after the indispensable pension cheque. At that moment, a girl came out of a provision shop across the square, walking obliquely past the market cross in the direction of the King's Arms. And Bain, one hand cupped to shelter his match, his face inclined slightly downward, noticed the remarkable grace of her little feet. He glanced lazily up, then he threw away his match, let his cigarette go unlit, and instinctively straightened. He had not seen this lady before, but in that second it passed through his mind whimsically, perhaps she's to Saworth. Surely a man might travel a great way without meeting such a face as hers. Pale, very pale, with lips a glowing natural red and black hair gathered with taste, at the back of her head into a heavy roll that rested upon her firm shoulders. Her chin, too, was delicately firm. She carried herself with a dignity that seems to be dying from modern life, looking straight ahead, as if in some reverie that walled her away from the grossness of Saworth, yet not, Bain judged from her mouth, a reverie wholly pleasant. Among the mill girls and shop assistants and bedraggled housewives in Saworth, there was none anything like her, and few anywhere else. As she passed by the King's Arms, she seemed to notice Bain. Their eyes met briefly. Then she lowered her lashes, unsmiling, and was gone up the Vennel. "Och, he's a bonny one, Mrs. Lurlin." Happening to come to the door as the girl passed by, old MacLeod, who kept the King's Arms, had followed Bain's long look. "There willna be her like for I, Mr. Bain, not at old Saworth Place." MacLeod shook his head portentously. In his youth he'd been a gardener at some house of Lord Bute's, and he continued to hold the county families in profound respect, muttering sourly about communists among the miners who drank in his bar. "She's young to have the care of a big house," said Bain, relapsed into lethargy, and lighting his cigarette at last. "Aye, and we to be widowed, sir. Knew the house. She canna hope to keep it in the old way, ye ken. Twa maids, and they carlins for her gurnins, sir. Sma comforted a cold house, the narsack canny, when all's said. We rack and ruin forby were half the great houses in the county." And MacLeod proceeded to expatiate on his favourite topics. The decay of old families and the follies of socialism. "A widow," put in Bain, lifting his heavy eyelids a bit. She couldn't have been married a great while. What was this Lurlin like? Be what he was, sir. The gentleman's dead the year new, Mr. Bain, and smile good clavering o'er men in the grave. That said, MacLeod turned back into his pub, but Bain, surprised at this reticence in a publican who ordinarily manifested a full share of Scottish censoriousness, followed him. He didn't die in the war? Inquired Bain. No, said MacLeod, thus brought to bay, and presently, the drink, sir, the drink, that and mair. Dinna mistake me, Mr. Bain. The Lurlins were braw and blued, aye, but this Mr. Alistair Lurlin, he was no the proper line, ye ken, no more than a cousin. Mr. Hamish Lurlin, the old laird, died 7 years syne, and his twa sons were shot in Libya, first Alexander, then Hugh. Our 3 death duties mun be paid, and the cousin comes to what is left. Last year, there's Mr. Alistair dies, mere duties. Wheel, Mrs. Lurlin keeps the hoose, and the policies, and a bit more besides. 90,000 acres Lurlin of Saworth had before the first war, no, but a hoose who was uncool, cold, and clammy. Come away upstairs, sir, if you be sae fascinated. This a trifle spitefully. And you can see the old place for the attic, if ye good een. From a garret window of the King's Arms, they looked over the pantiles and corrugated iron roofs of the shabby town towards the serrate ridge some miles westward. On a flank of that hill, Bain just could make out the grey shape of a big ancient house, wraith-like against the heather and gorse and bracken. There'll be nane older in the county, said the MacLeod. Bain went down alone to the parlour, sat some minutes before the doddering fire, and then addressed a note to Mrs. Lurlin, Saworth Place. He wrote truthfully enough, rather than dilettante in architecture. Recently he'd heard her house spoken of as remarkable. He'd be glad to see it if no inconvenience would be caused. And he would be in Saworth the rest of the week. After some hesitation, he signed himself at MC. The military cross, after all, was one of his few remaining links with decent society, and he had the right to use it. This letter posted, he went up to his room, brushed his old tweed suit, and glanced at himself in the mirror. The heavy eyes, the long and regular features weakened by lines of indecision, the defiant half-grin of bravado. He grimaced, and the suture in the back of his head, a memento of the shell fragment that had given him his pension, winced in sympathy. To escape from self-dislike, he went down to the bar, very like fleeing from a cell into the jail yard. You just got to make the effort, Matthew. It's not too bad. It's not too bad. I mean, I may be butchering it. Late the next afternoon, an answer to his note came, written in a small round hand, which said that Mr. Bain would be shown about Saworth Place if he should call on Thursday afternoon, and was signed Anne Lurlin. The firm signature put Mrs. Bain in mind of Mrs. Lurlin's elegant pale look, and he spent most of the intervening evening and night and morning in a reverie of nearly forgotten faces, men he had alienated by his negligence or his improvidence, women he had found hollow, or had found him exasperating. None of these ever thought of him now, even when dreaming before the fire, and why should they? Shortly past noon on Thursday, he walked along an empty road towards the ridge called Saworth Law. The road became a lane between high and crumbling stone dykes, and then he was at the entrance to a neglected park on the side of a hill. Its gates vanished, its gate lodge empty, all its larger trees felled by some timber merchant, and the stumps left among heaps of dead leaves. Bain turned up the drive, and soon he could see on the bare slope above the massive stone shape of the place of Saworth. 2 square towers at either end, and between them extending also far to the rear an immense block of building in part ashlar, but mostly rubble. None of this, except a fine large window above the entrance, was later than the 17th century, and most was far older. An intricacy of crow-stepped gables, turrets, dormers, and chimneys confused one's eyes when they roved upward. All in all, the place was an admirable example of the Scots mansion house, unprettified by Balmoralism. A flight of heavy stone steps led up to the door, and on either side of the entrance projected a conical capped turret, each supported at its base by an enormous corbel, curiously bevelled. Some rods to the north could be made out to be what was left of a detached building, the roof of it gone, a chapel perhaps. As far as Bain could see, there were only 2 entrances. The grand portal, and a small heavy door with a wrought iron grille below it that probably gave upon the kitchen. At the angles of either tower, musket holes or arrow loops, some blocked with mortar, the rest now closed with small panes of glass, flanked the entrance. The roofs were of ancient stone slabs. Away at the back, the stout dikes of a walled garden closed the view, although Bain could hear the rushing of a burn somewhere in that direction. The lawn before the place was unkempt, no better than pasture, and there, in one of the towers and even in the main block, a broken pane glinted in the afternoon sun, and all about the strong grey house hung a suggestion of neglect and impoverishment that would have been more clearly manifest, doubtless, had not the mansion been so severe and rugged in its very character. The huge window of what must be the great hall broke the solidity of the facade just above the main door. Between this window and the doorway below, Bain perceived, as he climbed the steps, a terribly weathered coat of arms executed in a soft red sandstone, appended to it some pious inscription in venerably barbarous Scots Latin characters, most of them indecipherable. He could read only the two words which composed the last line. Lava resurgat. Lava resurgat? Why lava rather than spiritus? The old laird sometimes put things quaintly. He found no bell and so banged at the oaken door with a rusty knocker. After an interval of leaden silence, the door was pulled ajar a bit and a sour woman's face peeked round it. Bain asked to be announced. The fat maid let him into a little round room with naked stone walls at the stairfoot, and locked the door again, and then conducted him up a twisting stone stair in one of the entrance turrets, its treads scooped hollow by centuries of feet, to a gigantic vaulted chamber, well lighted, the hall. It was fitted with 16th century panelling, painted with heraldic symbols and family crests. The air was cold, the yawning medieval fireplace quite empty. Here and there, a Jacobean carved cupboard, or the polished surface of a table, or a tapestry chair, endeavoured to apologise for the emptiness of the place. None of the furniture seemed in good repair. Bain sat gingerly on a Chippendale piece, while the maid scurried off to some hidey hole in the labyrinth of a house. Pardon me. After 3 or 4 minutes, Mrs. Lurling came down to him, emerging from behind a door concealed by a hanging. A faint smile hovered on her fine lips. Her eyes met his composedly, and Bain thought her most beautiful in an antique fashion. "I'll show you the curiosities of this draughty place, Mr. Bain," she said in a low voice with an agreeable suggestion of West Coast accent about it. "If you'll pledge yourself to ignore dust and damp. I've nothing left but the house and the policies and a bit of more, not even a home farm." Bain hardly knew what he said in reply, for she unsettled him as if he had been shaken awake. Then Mrs. Lurling led him up disused stairs and down into vaulted cellars and through chambers with mouldering tapestries and Lord knows where else. Almost all these interminable rooms were empty. "Most was gone before the place became mine," said Mrs. Lurling without visible embarrassment, "but I had to sell what was left of the furniture, except for a few sticks and what were really necessary rooms. I suppose the wreckers will buy the house when I'm dead. You can sell an 18th century house just possibly in spite of rates, but not a behemoth like this. I can't afford to live here, but I can't afford to go away either. Do you have some great barn of this sort, Mr. Bain?" "I haven't even a cottage," Bain told her, "or a stick of furniture." He thought her black eyes remarkably candid. She took him up to the summit of one of the towers where they stood in the wind and looked over the braes that paralleled the den of Saworth water as it twists down to the sharp-toothed long skerries where it meets the sea. From this height they could see quite clearly the surf on the rocks, and some distance south, smoke from the fishing village of Saworthness. Saworth water was in spate. Just at the tower's feet, the den veered right up to the castle, so that a stone which Bain tossed over the rampart bounced down a steep slope into the roaring burn. In the rough old days, the lairds of Saworth had the security of a strongly situated house. "You're not afraid of heights, Mr. Bain?" asked the young woman. "No," he said, "I've climbed a great deal." "I fancy you're afraid of very little," she observed, lifting her eyebrows slightly. "Do you know where I happened to see you in the square 2 days ago? I thought you looked like a soldier." "What were you?" He had been a captain, he told her. "Come down into the policies, Captain Bain," she said. As they descended, he bumped his head against the window ledge and cried out involuntarily. She stopped with an exclamation of sympathy. "A mortar put a crack in my skull," Bain apologised. "I'm still tender and probably always will be." "Does it pain you much, Captain Bain?" "No, but perhaps I ought to tell you it makes me a trifle odd now and then, or so people seem to think." He did not mind confiding this to her. Perhaps it was the odyssey he had just acknowledged, but at the moment they two seemed to him the only realities in an infinity of shadows. "So much the better." she said still lower. Either that or something of the sort. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Lerlin. I mean this, Captain Bain. We seem to be birds of a feather. People hereabouts thinks I'm rather odd. Saworth Place is soaked in oddity. The maids won't stay. I've only one now. The other went last week, and even Margaret, who's left, won't sleep in. She goes down to her son's cottage. I don't suppose you know why Janet went, unless someone at the King's Arm told you the gossip. Well, Janet wouldn't stay because she thought something whispered to her in the cellars. Poor timid creature. It was all fancy, for if anything were to whisper, you know, it would whisper to me. Would you like to see the garden? Most of it has gone back, of course. They poked about the overgrown walks of the policies, talking of trifles, and presently strayed near the chapel ruin. May I glance inside? Asked Bain. Oh, there's very little, she answered somewhat sharply, but Bain already had passed through the broken doorway. Some defaced 16th and 17th century monuments were fixed to the walls, and a litter of leaves encumbered the pavement. Where his feet scattered these, Bain noticed 2 or 3 ancient bronze rings were fixed to the walls, and a litter of leaves encumbered the pavement. Where his feet scattered these, Bain noticed 2 or 3 ancient bronze rings fixed in stone slabs, and being rather vain of his strength of arm, he bent, gripped one of them, and pulled upward. The stone lifted very slightly, though it was heavy, and when Bain let go the ring, the slab set with a dull reverberation. Oh, for God's sake, stop! He swung round to her. That delicate pallor of her young face had gone grey. She clutched at the door moulding for support. Bain took her hands in his to save her from falling and led her towards the house. What is it, Mrs. Lerlin? He felt mingled alarm and pleasure thus to have a bond between them, even the terror in her eyes. You shouldn't have done that. He's under, just under. Of course, in his wool-gathering, Bain had nearly forgotten this girl ever had a husband. He muttered something awkward in his contrition. I thought, with the leaves about and everything, so neglected, you know, I thought no one would have been laid there this century. She was calmer now, and they re-entered the house through the kitchen door. I know. They shouldn't have put anyone there after all this time. His uncle and grandfather in the kirkyard in the village, and his 2 cousins. But he had himself buried in the old crypt. He wrote it to his will. Do you understand why? Because he knew I'd loathe it. I think tea will be ready, Captain Bain. At the tea table, in a pleasant corner room of one tower, she was cool and even witty. Bain saw in her a girl become woman in some short space, a year or 2 perhaps. She was charming, possibly wise. But something stirred woefully now and again beneath this pretty surface. The afternoon went rapidly and smoothly. When it was time for Bain to leave, she went with him to the great door, and she said deliberately, Come to tea tomorrow, if you like. Startled, Bain hesitated, and she caught him up with just the hint of a flash in her eyes before he'd said anything. But don't trouble, Captain Bain, if you're to be busy. I'm never busy, Mrs. Lerlin, he told her, unable to repress his old arrogant grin. Shall I be frank? I was surprised you should ask me. I'm thoroughly déclassé. She looked at him steadily. I believe you're decent. I have no friends, and I hate to be solitary here day on day. I'm afraid to be alone. I wouldn't take you to be timid, Mrs. Lerlin. Don't you understand? I thought you'd guessed. She came a trifle close to Bain, and she said in her low, sweet voice, I'm afraid of my husband. Bain stared at her. Your husband? I understood. I thought that he's dead. Quite, said Anne Lerlin. Somewhere in that Minoan maze of a house, a board or table creaked, the wind rattled a sash, and this little room at the stairfoot was musty. You know, don't you? Mrs. Lerlin whispered. You know something's near. Bain stayed on at the King's Arms, and every afternoon he walked up the barren lawn to Saworth Place for tea. Some days he came early, and with Mrs. Lerlin he tramped over the muir of Saworth, talking of books and queer corners and the small things of nature. Anne Lerlin, he perceived, was one of those women, now unhappily rare, who delight in knowing about squirrels' habits and in watching field mice and peeking into birds' nests with a childlike curiosity quite insatiable. On one afternoon they reached the summit of the law and looked back upon the place. A vast twisted oak, still bare of new leaves, stood halfway between them and the house, its black branches outlined like fingers against the grey of the distant mansion. This was the finest of many brave views on the muir of Saworth, and they could see the colliery, a dismal smudge far down in the valley, and the red roofs of Saworth village, at this remove still seeming the douce market town that it once had been. In the several days that had elapsed since Bain's first call, Mrs. Lerlin had not touched upon the theme of her parting shot at the stairfoot, and Bain had been content to let that field lie fallow, but now she clutched his arm, and he sensed the mood was upon her again. She was looking intently towards a rise this side of the oak. Do you... She checked herself and said instead, do I seem rational to you, Captain? She did, he told her, but he said nothing of all the rest he felt about her. I'm going to put your confidence to the test. He observed her charming lips were pressed tightly together when for a moment she was silent. Do you think you see anything between us and that tree? Bain studied the face of the moor. At first he detected nothing, then for just an instant it seemed as if some large stooping creature had hurried from one hillock to another, perhaps its back showing above the bracken. I don't know, Mrs. Llewellyn, he said a bit too quickly. A dog? It didn't seem like a dog to you now, did it? She looked into his eyes and then turned her sleek head back toward the moor. No, I suppose it's a man out ferreting, but he let his inflection rise toward the end of the sentence. No one keeps ferrets here, Captain Bain. I'm glad you saw it too, because I feel less mad. But I don't think anyone else would have made it out. You saw it because you know me so well, and because of that crack in your poor head, perhaps. I fancy it makes you sensitive to certain things. Bain thought it kindest to be blunt. He asked her what way she was rowing. Let's sit down here on the heather, then, she went on, where we can see for a good way round. I'd rather not talk about this when we're in the house. First I ought to say something about my husband. Perceiving that all this hurt her, Bain murmured that he'd been told her late husband had been no credit to the family. No, said Anne Llewellyn, no. Have you read Trollope, Captain? Perhaps you remember how he described Sir Florian in the Eustace Diamonds. Sir Florian Eustace had only two flaws. He was vicious and he was dying. Now Lizzie Eustace married Florian knowing these things, but I didn't know them about my husband when I married. I hadn't any money and no relative left worth naming. Alastair, though he looked sick even then, had manners. I don't suppose I wanted to look very closely. Afterwards I found he was foul. Bain dug his fingers into the heather. If we were to walk down toward that tree, said Mrs. Llewellyn after a silence, I don't think we'd meet anything, not yet. I don't believe there's any body to what we saw. I fancy it was only a kind of presentiment. I've been here alone here more than once and caught a glimpse of something and made myself hunt, but nothing ever was there. Supposing a thing like that could rise, Bain interjected, stealthily surveying the bracken. Why should he have power over you? You're not foul. She did not seem to hear him. He wanted everything to be vile, and me to be vilest of all. Sometimes I think it was the pain of dying in him that made him try to befoul everything. When he found he couldn't break me, he cursed like a devil, really as if he were in hell. But I stayed with him to his last day. I was his wife, whatever he was. Most of the time he lay with his eyes shut, only gasping. But in the evening, when he was nearly gone, I could see he was trying to speak, and I bent down, and he smirked and whispered to me, You think you've won free, Anne? No, wait a year, I'll want you then. A year? Asked Bain. It'll be a year next Friday. Now I'm going to confess something. She turned her lithe body so that her eyes looked directly into Bain's. When I saw you in the square, I wondered if I could use you. I had some notion that I might stick a life between myself and... You don't know better than a daredevil. Do you mind me saying that? Something in me whispered, he was made to take chances. That's what he's good for. I meant you to come to see me. I don't suppose it flatters you, Ralph, to be snared by a mad woman. No, Bain answered her, you're not mad. We both may be dolls in someone's dream, Anne, but you're not mad. And you'd best go for good, she said. She told him, I don't want to stain you with this now that I know you. I want you to go away. You can't dismiss me, Bain contrived to grin his old grin. I'm in your net. But how am I to get into your mind, Anne? How am I to stand between you and what your memory calls up? If it were only memory and fancy, I could bear it. She shut her eyes. A glimpse of him in a dream, a trick of imagination where I turn a dark corner, the shape dodging on the moor, those might pass away, but I think he's coming. Now you'll know I'm fit for bedlam. I think he's coming, well, in the flesh or something like. Nonsense, said Bain. Very well, then I'm mad, but you'll bear with me, Ralph. Perhaps something in me calls him. Possibly I even control him after a fashion, but I think he'll be here Friday night. Believing she might faint, Bain put his big hand behind her head. If you really think that, Anne, leave the house and we'll go to Edinburgh or London or where you like. We'll leave now. Where could I live? She nodded toward the grey castle. It's all I have, not even enough to pay my rent anywhere else. And then it'd make no difference. I think he'd follow me. He wants life to drag down with him. Either he must break me, or he must be broken somehow himself before he'll rest. Bain sat a while and presently asked, "Do you want me to watch in Saworth Place on Friday night, Anne?" She turned away her head as if ashamed of her selfishness. "I do." It passed through his mind that she might think he was making a rake's bargain with her over this wild business. A bargain he might have made with another woman, or even with this one at another time, he admitted to himself, but not with a woman beside herself with terror. "You understand, Anne," he blurted, "that I'm asking nothing of you, not now." "I know," she whispered, her face still averted. "I'm offering nothing but your death of fright." Then she tried to laugh. Who would think, to look at you, Captain Bain, that you're so very proper? I'd rather be scandalous than damned." Thus it was settled, and though they two walked and talked and drank their tea on the Tuesday and the Wednesday and the Thursday, they did not mention again her past or their future. Whatever sighed in some passage or cupboard of that old house, whatever shifted and faded across the moor, why such intimations they ignored, speaking instead of the warps that cried from the sky above them, or of the stories they had loved as children. Old Saworth Place still was fit to stand a siege, Bain told himself as he mounted the staircase between the turrets on Friday afternoon. The lower windows could not be forced, the doors were immensely stout. Anything that had substance might scrape and pound in vain outside all night once the bolts were shot home. Anne Lerlin herself admitted him, and they went to sit in her little study, and the hours fled, and their tea, untasted, grew cold. And at length they heard fat Margaret shuffle down the kitchen passage, open the door, and make her way through the policies toward the distant sanctuary of her son's house. Then Anne's eyes seconded Bain's glance, and he ran down the stair to the kitchen door, locked it, and made sure the great door was well locked. He returned to the study, and the pale girl with the great black eyes. The night was coming on. They could think of very little to say. Here was Bain locked in for the night with the woman that he most desired, though he had known many women too well. Yet Tantalus be his delight. Unless she sought him, he would not touch her in this her hour of dismay. "Where will you stay?" asked Bain, when the sun had sunk quite below the level of the little west window of the study. "In my window," she said drearily enough. "There's no place safer." Her room was in the southern tower. Bain's mind reviewed the plan of the place. "Is there a way into the tower except through the great hall?" She shook her sweet head. "There were doors on the other levels once, but they were blocked long ago." That made his work easier. "Well then, Anne, your bogle will have to swallow me whole before he opens the door behind the hanging, and I'm a sour morsel." He didn't admit the possibility of fleshly revenants, Bain told himself, and if he could keep herself safe from frenzy this one night, she might be safe forever after. Solemn as a hanging judge, she looked at him for what seemed a long time. "You shouldn't stay here, Ralph. I shouldn't have let you." She ran her little tongue along her dry lips. "You know I never can be anything to you." This was said with a kind of frozen tenderness. These words hurt him beyond belief, and yet he had expected them. He saw himself as in a mirror, his shallow, tired, defiant face, his frayed clothes, every long, lazy inch of himself, futile and fickle. "No," said Bain, managing a hoarse laugh. "No, Anne, of course you can't. Or not tonight. I meant to sit outside your door." Biting her lip, she murmured, "Not tonight, not any other night ever." "Well," Bain said, "you needn't drive the point home with a hammer. Besides, you might care for me in better days." She continued to look at him as if beseeching mercy. "You don't understand me, Ralph. It's not you. Why, so far as I can still care for any man, I care for you. Anyway, I'm grateful to you as I've never been to anyone else, and I give myself to you if I could. It's not what you think. It's this. After having a year with him, I couldn't bear to be anything with a man again. It would be dreadful. I can't forget." "Don't tell yourself that," Bain spoke slowly and heavily. "It won't be true. Given time, this night in your life with that fellow will wash away, but I suppose I'll be gone, and good riddance." She lit a candle. Paraffin lamps and candles were the only lighting in the place. Now he knew their night of listening and guarding must commence. "You still can go, Ralph," she told him softly. "A moment ago I hinted I felt something for you, but that was because I tried to be kind. Kind, well, whatever makes you do this for me, and honestly, I don't love you, though I should." "Bravado," Bain said, and boredom mixed. He was glad she could not see his eyes or his mouth in the feeble candlelight. "No, up with you and let me play my game of hide-and-seek, Anne Llewellyn." He went with her to the door behind the hanging and watched her ascend to the first turn of the stair. Looking back upon him, she contrived a smile of understanding and was gone to her room. Alone, he felt a swelling of confidence. "Come on, if you like, Alistair Llewellyn, Esquire," he thought. "I'm your man for a bout of creep mouse." Before settling himself into the hall for the night, he must make sure that no one was playing tricks, a remote possibility he had kept at the back of his mind by way of a forlorn link with the world of solid things. So, taking his little electric torch from a pocket, he proceeds to inspect every chill corner of the place, apart from Anne's south tower, with a military thoroughness. Certain corners in this pile were calculated to make one wary, but they were empty, every one. After a half hour or so, he found himself looking from a loophole in the north tower and across the main block of the house. He saw a light glowing from Anne's window. There she would be lying in a passion of dread, but nothing should force itself upon her this night. Returning to the main block, he listened. Nothing. For a parson's son, he thought, Ralph Bain gets into peculiar nooks. Then he opened a door into the great hall. Oh God, something white was by the stair door, even then, slipping out of the hall into the turret. He flung himself across the hall, down the stair, and leaped the last twist of the spiral to overtake that white fugitive. It was Anne Llewellyn pressing herself against the great door. She shuddered there in her nightgown, her slim, naked feet upon the damp flagstones. For a tremulous instant, he thought his own desperate longing might have stirred some impulse in her, that she might have come to him out of love or gratitude, but a glance at her face undid his hope. She was nearly out of her mind, a tormented thing fumbling at the oak, and when he took her by the arms, he panted spasmodically and managed to say, "I don't know why I'm here. I wanted to run out, run and run." For only a moment he pressed her body to his. Then, picking her up, he carried her to the door behind the hanging and thrust her in. "Go back, Anne. I've promised you." She put both her chill hands in his, looked to him as if she were to paint his picture, and kissed him lightly with cold lips. Then she crept up the steps. He bolted the little tapestried door from his side. Well, back to sentry duty. What hadn't he inspected in this house? The cellars. Down you go, Captain Bain. There were fine old Scots vaults of flinty stone, those cellars, but he detested them this night. Outside, a light rain was falling. He sat upon a broken stool in the cellar that had been a medieval kitchen, shadowed by the protruding oven. This was the ragtag end of chivalry, all right, a worn-out fool crouching in a crumbling house to humour a crazy girl. There's something crunched on the gravel outside the barred window. From old soldierly habit, Bain kept stock still in the shadow. He saw it plain, so there could be no possibility of illusion, and he asked himself in a frantic sensation of which he was once ashamed, "What have you got into, Ralph Bain, for the sake of a pretty little thing that won't be yours?" It was a face at the slit of a window, damn it, a sickening face, the nose snubbed against the glass like a little boy's at the sweet shop. The eyelids of the face were drawn down. But while Bain watched, they slowly opened as if drawn upward by a power beyond themselves, and the face turned awkwardly upon its neck, surveying the cellar. Somehow Bain knew, with an immense temporary relief, that he was not perceived in his sanctuary back of the oven, supposing the thing could perceive in any ordinary way. Then the face withdrew from the window, and again Bain heard the gravel crunch. Some little time elapsed before Bain could make his muscles obey him. The crunching grew fainter, and then, hearing with a preternatural acuity, he made out a fumbling at the small kitchen door down the passage. But it was a vain fumbling. Something groped, lifted the latch, pressed its weight against the barrier. The stout door did not budge. At this, Bain experienced a reckless exultation. Whatever was outside in the night obeyed in some sort the laws of matter. "Go on, your dead hands," thought Bain wildly. "Fumble, damn you, push, scratch like a cat. You'll not get at her." Rising from his stool, Bain tiptoed down the passage and heard the stumbling feet in the gravel moving on. Would it try the big door? Of course. Let it try. Bain told himself he had to look at what was outside, and he made his way to the lowest loophole of the left-hand turret which commanded the steps. There was moon enough to show him the stairs, and they were empty, but the great door, a trifle ajar, was just closing behind whatever had entered. He sucked in his breath and believed he'd go mad. Oh Lord, it's in and I'm done for." Those phrases thrust through his consciousness like hot needles. Yet a dogged rationality contended against them. However had the door been forced? Then he thought of Anne in her nightgown. Before he had caught her, she must have drawn the bolt, and he, in his lovesick anxiety, had forgotten to try it. Collusion between the living and the damned, this conjecture of treachery woke in him, and he felt momentarily that all his days with Anne Lurlin had been part of a witch's snare. But he rejected the doubt. Whatever had moved Anne, whether simple terror and a foolish hope of flight, or some blind impulse forced to put her upon her out of the abyss, no deceit lay in her. These sterile reflections occupied no mensurable time. Face it out, Bain. Nothing else for it. With luck, he'd be in the hall first. He was up the kitchen stair and through an anteroom as fast as ever he had moved in his life. An uncertain moonlight showed him the hall, and he was alone in it, barring the way to the tapestried door. But then the door from the turret stair opened. Something entered. Just inside the hall, the thing paused heavily. Light enough came from the great window to outline it. Bain had not the heart to pull out his torch. Indeed, he could not move at all. Again, he looked upon the sagging face he had seen at the cellar loop. The thing was clothed in a black suit, all mildewed. Its slow body seemed to gather itself for new movement. Who should be master, who should move first? These points might decide the issue, Bain hoped. Perhaps a horrid logic governed this contest. Ralph Bain then compelled himself to take 2 steps forward toward the middle of the hall. He looked at the dark shape by the window and twice tried to speak, and on the third attempt a few broken words croaked from his throat. "Time you were properly buried, old man." No answering sound came. Bain flexed his arms, but could not force himself to advance further. He could discern no expression upon the face, only a blackened mask obedient to some obedient impulse, some obscene impulse from a remote beyond. How long they two stood there, Bain did not know, but presently the thing swung about awkwardly, lurched over the threshold, and was gone back to the darkness of the stair turret. Bain thanked God with all sincerity. Now who was the hunter and who the quarry? The will was in him to make an end of the thing. Would it have gone back to the door and out into the rain? Bain listened. Yes, there came a stumbling on the stair from above. What was it trying for? And then Bain knew. Oh, what a fool he was. It was ascending to the roofs and would cross the slabs to the woman whose passionate terror perhaps animated its shape. Bain went after it, slipping and bruising himself in his urgency. But as he leaped up the spiral toward the higher stories of the North Tower, he felt a cold draught sweeping down upon him. The thing had got open a window and must be upon the roof. Bain found that window and stared into the night. Now the rain fell heavily, and down at the foot of the wall Saworth water moaned and gleamed. From Anne Lurlin's room the candlelight cast some faint radiance upon the stone slabs of the sharp-peaked roof, and the glimmer was enough to show Bain a sodden bulk inching its way along the gutter toward the south tower, a footing precarious enough in daylight. The ruined face was averted from Bain, whatever power moved the thing being intent upon that piteous lighted window. What propelled Ralph Bain then was an impulse beyond duty, beyond courage, beyond even the love of woman. He dropped from the window upon the wet and shimmering slabs, clambered along the gutter, and flung himself down toward the dark hulk. Bain heaved with all the strength that was in him. Together, living and dead, they rolled upon the mossy old stones. Together, they fell. A glimpse of the great stone wall, a flash of the savage burn, then explosion of everything, opening to the blessed dark. Early on Saturday morning, a lone fisherman out of Saworthness, rowing near the reefs that lie off the mouth of Saworth water, thought he perceived some unpleasant mass lying nearly submerged in the tangle of kelp among the rocks. But the sea boils nastily there, and the fisherfolk of Saworthness are of the old legend-cherishing sort, and this man recalled certain things muttered by the arthritic old hag in the chimney corner, his mother. Rather than rowing closer in, then, he worked his boat round and made back toward the decayed little harbour. Some hours later, having got 2 friends into his boat for company, he returned to the skerries for a closer look, but the tide had ebbed, and if anything human or human-like had lodged earlier among the rocks, now it was gone forever. Whatever ends in the boiling sea upon the reefs, having tumbled down the den of Saworth water, never wakes again. The end. That's the end of Saworth Place. I'll, as I say, I'll read another quite short story by Kirk in a minute, but I don't know if anyone who's watching had any comments on that one or any questions about that one while I have a drink. other than Matthew's concern about the Scottish brogue. That is only the one character. That's just the what's his face, the landlord. There's not a sense at the Anne Lernin, though. I guess she's a Western Isles lady, or perhaps from the Covenanter coast. She doesn't seem to have a strong accent. So, given I'm not necessarily very good at accents, it's it's convenient for me to try to avoid anything other than that. Bane, Bane is a character who Kirk does return to and find interesting. What's coming up? Yeah, Captain Bane is Kirk kind of uses him again in interesting, peculiar ways, and it's certainly worth following Kirk's work to pick up more stuff around him. So yes, poor and pitiful here, though. I think that quote from Burke at the start, what is it? The unbought grace of life, the cheap defence of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise is gone. The age of chivalry is gone. And of course, that's what Captain Bane remembers or has come back to him. And that's that Bane has this moment, doesn't he, of feeling like they are the only real things in this very peculiar setting, this kind of traumatized widow in a massive rambling house with one servant, which is very Kirkian. That kind of theme comes up a few times, being aided by a weird, wandering, brain-damaged loser, and that they are nonetheless the realer things. So Kirk was American, though he went really the point about whether or not naked feet versus bare feet. I mean, I think bare feet is much more common probably everywhere. I think there's obviously an effect being gone for there, isn't there? Perhaps unsuccessful in this case. But no, Kirk was American. He was from Michigan, but he went to university at St Andrews at a point before US PhDs had invaded the place. And I think certainly Scotland and Scottish atmosphere was very, very important for his stories, his fiction. Well, yeah, given that the two people involved are a traumatized young widow and a brain damaged ex-soldier, certainly you're permitted, I think, to think that. Anne Lerlin certainly thinks that it's real, but it might not seem real, or maybe the only reason that he can see it is because I think that it's probably okay to make a punt in terms of like liminal meaning, how far you can push that. It's okay to say there's some psychic phenomenon there. That's the thing I think is fine. Probably it's not simply a sort of marsh gas delusion, or if it is, it's a strange one because it's a marsh gas delusion that leads to a redemption, i.e. that Bane acts well, he does something worthwhile and noble. So it must be a good marsh gas delusion if that's the case. I should say that quote from Burke that starts it, which I'd forgotten started it. I mean, it's not surprising when you think about what Kirk's influences are, but certainly that is maybe the finest passage of many fine passages in Burke. If you're looking for just very, very good early modern rhetoric, that section of Reflections is very, very good. I think there's a few other epigraphs. I'll move on to the next story in a moment, but there are a few other epigraphs. Yeah. Balgrimo's hell hath no limits, nor is circumscribed in one self place. For where we are is hell, and where hell is, there we must ever be. Is that Faustus? Is that Mephistopheles in it doesn't say, but is that Marlowe's Faustus? Lex talionis, so you shall not pollute the land wherein you are, for blood it defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it. Numbers 35-33. There's a very, very good he has a very good instinct for the dramatic epitaph. Anyway, an encounter by Mortstone Pond. This is a quite short one. We die with the dying, see they depart and we go with them. We are born with the dead, see they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. Little Gidding by T.S. Eliot. To the north, the little town of Mortstone in Michigan is bounded by the old mill pond. Along Earth Dyke, great willows rooted in it, runs out to the dam of rubble. On a November morning in the year 1919, with thick white mist upon pond and dike, Gerard Pierce was walking slowly back from the tumult of waters at the dam towards Sloat's store and the old miller's house on the knoll above the pond. From the dike he could see the mellow brick walls of the old tool store, star-shaped braces of iron set in those red walls to secure the iron rods that reinforced the brick. A little further down the winding mill pond road stood the white, handsome old house that some forgotten purse-proud miller had built in the Greek revival years. A warm house with recessed porch and pilasters at its entrance, and at the rear a labyrinth of storerooms and rat-plagued woodsheds, clapboard wing appended to clapboard wing. This had been Gerard's house ever since he'd been born. Now he was 10 years old and wishing he were dead. His father had been killed in France a year ago. They had buried his mother last week. The lovely house was to be sold, and in a few days he'd be sent to San Francisco to live with an aunt. Mr. and Mrs. Sloat had moved into his house to keep him company until then, and he hated the pair. They meant to buy the house, though not the derelict mill. 200 yards to the east of the house began the black cast-iron fence of the old Mortstone graveyard, where Gerard and his mother every spring had swept clean the stones of the early settlers. On the far side of the cemetery stood the tall granite monument to his soldier father, and now beside that was put the new small blank stone under which his mother lay. Since his mother's funeral, Gerard had spent his days stubbornly walking first out to the dike, to the dam's raging sluices, and then back along the mill pond road to the cemetery, where he would sit for hours under a yew close to the Pierce shaft. Mrs. Sloat said reproachfully that such conduct was morbid, but having taken the boy out of school in preparation for the trip to San Francisco, they could think of nothing better for him to do. Had he loved his mother as she deserved to be loved? How might he have loved her enough within himself? He could do nothing at all about that now. He stared at the classical lines of his house as he idled along the dike, trying to fix every detail in his memory. Great masses of maple leaves lay upon the lawn. They too were dead. His mother and he would light no more bonfires on Halloween. He was wholly and forever alone. There could come no relief ever from his misery. He had prayed by his mother's bedside in her pretty room for a month as she lay dying, and in her agony comforting her little son so far as she could. "You must grow up, my darling, to be the sort of man your father was," she had told him. Tears began to run down his face again. He did not trouble to brush them away. The thing to do, he had felt this impulse before, was to dash back along the dike and go over the dam. Then most abruptly a chill ran all through him. In horror, Gerard became aware that he was not alone. Someone who could not be seen now walked beside him on the dike. He could have hugged his mother's ghost, he had thought, should she have come to him. But now he was ice. He could hear no footsteps and could see only faint drifting curls of pond mist, yet he was aware of a dread pacing presence not palpable. Gerard forced himself to walk stiffly onward. Perhaps if he paid the thing no heed, it would drift away. Nevertheless, the presence continued to accompany him. He could not cry out, shriek for help, though he wished to. It was not his mother, no, this was a man, this presence, or something like a man, an angel, a devil. Now certain words from without were impressed upon his consciousness, although no voice sounded in his ears as speech is heard. Amidst the terror and the wonder of this encounter, somehow he contrived to grasp the meaning of what was being communicated to him. Silent words ran to this effect. The pain will end, boy, or nearly end. This too shall pass. You'll grow to be a man. They will love you always, being made for eternity. No more words penetrated to his consciousness, yet he felt, or thought he felt, the faintest pressure upon his right hand for the tiniest moment. Though no voice had sounded without, in some manner the words had possessed a tone, a timbre, grave and heartening. That tone and timbre had not been his father's, so far as he could recall his father's voice. The dreadful cold ebbed out of the boy's mind and body, but awe remained. On he walked, the presence accompanying him to the slope where the dike merged into the knoll. There, abruptly as he had come, the presence departed, although how he knew this, he could never explain to himself in later years. Gerard was weak in his knees, yet in his days he began to run, so fast as he was able, past the store, the miller's house, the white pines that lined the way back to the graveyard. Gasping, he knelt by his mother's blank tombstone and prayed as his mother had taught him to pray. His father's shaft cast its long shadow upon him. He had spelled out the words of its inscription 6 times. Now he did so again. Sacred to the memory of Jerome Pierce, 1889 to 1918, Captain of Infantry. Still seems it strange that thou shouldst live forever? Is it less strange that thou shouldst live at all? This is a miracle, and that no more. Gerard puzzled over the lines. He'd puzzle over them from time to time in the course of an eventful and violent life, long after the little uncanny episode on the dike had been forgotten, or he had settled into a most remote corner of his memory. The boy kissed his mother's headstone, pulled his shoulders back as his father had done, and left the graveyard. The communication on the dike had nerved him. 3 days later, commended to a conductor, he was put on a train to Chicago. Relatives there kept him overnight and saw him aboard the train to San Francisco. The pain will end, or nearly end, he kept repeating silently across plains, mountains, deserts, and as he grew up self-reliant and quiet, the pain of parting indeed was deadened or locked away and forgotten for the sake of survival. On a November morning in the year 1969, Major General Gerard Pierce, or what was left of him, walked stiffly along the dike leading to the dam at Mortstone Pond. The huge willow trees were dying of extreme old age. Fog shrouded them mercifully. His artificial leg troubled the general somewhat this morning, as it did many mornings. He'd been a year in hospital. He had lost the leg at Hue, and much more damage had been done to his body there. When he was released from hospital, the doctors had told him, with such tact as they possessed, that he ought to put his affairs in order. His wife had learned to live without him during those unending years in Indochina. He'd been with her only twice on brief furloughs all that long time. His return to her at last, heel appliances and scars, must have been to Sally the rising of a phantom. In his long absence, their children had been reared, schooled, married. Perhaps in eternity this wife and this husband would know one the other, as in some remote past they had loved, but it was otherwise here below. Discontent in San Francisco, he had thought of the town he had not seen since he was 10 years old. Had anyone ever cut an inscription upon his mother's name, his stone? Sally had raised no objection to his flying to Michigan merely a fortnight after their reunion. She had not inquired as to when precisely he had come back to her. At the San Francisco airport, he had detected in her eyes some pity and some terror. Mortstone, like nearly all the world, had been altered mightily in half a century, and not for the better. The heart of the town had been urban, renewed nearly out of existence. A tremendous interstate highway cut off the lower town from the rest of the place. Yet his Boyhead's lower town, near the mill pond, had been spared to his surprised pleasure. The mill had been demolished and the willows were senile, but otherwise time had been kindly. Sloat's tall store still remained, though vacant. What mattered most was the miller's house. It stood in neat repair, occupied by somebody or other, praise be, even if the nethermost woodshed had been swept away and a brown brick chimney erected to the south side marred the symmetry of the temple house. Descending the slope with some difficulty, Gerard Pierce had limped all the way out to the dam. There he had rested for a quarter of an hour, dreamily watching the river spout and gurgle through the sluices. He might have been Heraclitus musing there, but why reproach the river of time? He had loved, fought, gloried in his victories, endured with some fortitude his defeats. Life is for action, some philosopher had written. Well, Gerard Pierce had known plenty of action. He had succeeded in life, in that he had done what his dying mother instructed him to do, to become such a man as his father had been. Now for the graveyard, a double entente that. The general rose from the damp bench and turned back down the dyke path toward his old house and the little visited cemetery beyond it. He would walk the whole way, ache or no ache. There's a question of who's to be the master, that's all, his broken body or his will. He had trudged nearly halfway to the knoll where there ran through him a thrill far stronger than the pain in his stump, for someone unseen was walking beside him. He very nearly cried out. Did the mist suggest some small form? No sound came to him but the rushing and splashing from the dam. His hearing and his eyesight had suffered at Hue, yet he did not require keenness of eye and ear to know that he was accompanied. What walked beside him, a sense beyond the senses informed the general, was a being intensely miserable, abandoned to despair. The general, long familiar with death in many forms, steeled himself to respond to a dumb appeal. After what he had seen and done in other lands, no bodiless companion could affright him, so the general endeavoured to assure himself. The thing beside him was like one of his own men ripped up by automatic fire, or like a broken adversary begging for mercy. Was it a boy of 10 in agony of spirit? Words came into the general's head, and after some choking in his throat, he managed to utter them. The pain will end, boy, or nearly end. This too shall pass. You'll grow to be a man. They'll love you always, being made for eternity. He reached out with his good left hand. Was it an illusion that for the briefest possible moment flesh encountered flesh? No intelligible response came, no word, no touch, unless that faintest of hand sensations was the ghost of a touch. But a kind of sympathetic warmth crept through the general's infirm, chilled body. The invisible boy continued by his side until the foot of the knoll was reached, and then what had been little despairing Gerard Pierce, perhaps heartened, was swept away by the current of time. General Pierce found himself now within the neglected graveyard, scarcely able to account for having made his heavy, painful way so far. The marvels of time, of consciousness, of personality nearly undid him. He sank down before his father's granite shaft. We are essences, the general thought, essences that flow like mercury. Each of us is a myriad of particles of energy held temporarily in combination by purposes or forces we understand no better than did Lucretius. We are essences, but insubstantial really, such stuff as dreams are made of, not understanding death because we do not know what life is. Across the gulf of years had the boy who was to be a man and the man who had been a boy met in some fashion, had a conscience spoken briefly to a conscience. Personality is a mask. The soul seems indefinable. What gives coherence to our essences? And erring reason's spite, the general wondered, am I a part of that once venerated mystical body? He looked up at his father's shaft. Fleshly life is a miracle. Young's lines told him in the deep-cut inscription, so is the life eternal. The encounter beside the mill pond of two aspects of a self had been miraculous and numbing, as is the way with miracles. Did those few words of assurance my older self gave to my younger self really issue from me? Or were they put into my consciousness by a tender other? Gerard Pierce of the later years limped a few feet to his mother's grave and went down on his knees to pray, as he had done half a century before. Someone, surely not these Sloats, had graven an inscription upon her stone. Perhaps the Detroit cousins on the distaff side had taken her epitaph from a 20th century poet. Requiescat in pace, Marjorie Johnson Pierce, 1890 to 1919. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Resurgam. The end. It's a rather different story, and they're both identifiably ghost stories, but they are, I think, pretty clearly different ends of the ghost story spectrum. And Mortstone Pond, I think it has one genuinely quite sublime moment, the moment where General Pierce suddenly has this sense that beside him there is a presence. But I think the encounter at Mortstone Pond is meant to be, there are fewer questions in it. I mean, I suppose that ends up being a question, doesn't it? Not just about the nature of time, but about was it worth it? Did it work out? He has become like his father, he is, he has been a good husband and a good father, though for many years now he has poured himself out for his country now to the last full measure of devotion. Was it worth it? What's the play? Um, but I think, yeah, it's much more simple. It's much more meant to sum up a particular image of the supernatural, of a supernatural encounter, which is the ghost in the past and the ghost in the future, and the way, and therefore, of course, partly an explanation about what ghosts are or might be. There's a sort of hard magic moment, we'd call it in fantasy, wouldn't we? But obviously, Kirk's not really interested in solving that problem. I think it's a lot less moody than Saworth Place, which, as you kind of indicated, I think, or implied, Matthew, kind of ends ambiguously. I don't mean ambiguously in terms of is Bane heroic. I mean ambiguously in terms of the last you see is he and this thing, which some you might even argue isn't real, leap off a roof and are dashed to death on the rocks below, hopefully helping poor Anne Lerlin settle and rest her dead. Yeah, I like Mortstone Pond a lot. It's also short, so it felt like it fit in well at the end of the session. There's other stories catching different things, and Kirk is typically, I think he's very good at setting up atmosphere, and he executes moderately well. Sometimes I kind of wish there's a slightly longer bit of string, not so much on Mortstone Pond, but on say Saworth Place. So I think maybe Balgrumo's Hell as well, which is another very good introductory story. Uncle Isaiah, I think, maybe is the right balance, but it's probably a less interesting story than the others. So yeah, I do recommend finding what you can online. This may be tough to get secondhand. It's from Eerdmans. It was obviously big company, but printed once, not back in print since. You can get some of the short stories, in individual kind of part volumes from the 70s and 80s, I think. They may actually be cheaper than this. I haven't checked for a while. But yeah, that is some Russell Kirk ghost stories. I don't know. Yeah. Any extra thoughts in the comments? And yeah, maybe we should go for some Gene Wolfe next time, given that did get the next most votes. So I've got to think about, maybe I need to read some more broadly in the short stories to have more options. But I'm certainly thinking Island of Dr. Death and other stories to start with. That's where I'm kind of currently going. Tolkien, I don't know, Leaf by Niggle seems, because that was another suggestion I put up, Leaf by Niggle seems like an obvious one to do, but then possibly the slightly stranger, sillier fairy ones are more interesting. I don't know. I need to, again, remind myself, but I think that could be an option. Leaf by Niggle is a very, very good story, and is probably Tolkien at some of his most self-revealing, I think. And for Lovecraft, if in terms of normal page length, it's got to be 20-ish pages. I think I did about just over 20 pages tonight, probably. Saworth Place in this is 17. Mortstone Pond is 7 or 6, perhaps. So 23, 24. But I yeah, so something like that, and I think that was similar to Tower of the Elephant. I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, there's some, like Innsmouth actually isn't that long. Norse Dulwich Horror, they might both be between 20 and 30, so maybe something like that. Obviously, some of the most interesting are a bit longer, but actually, he only writes one thing that could be defined, Lovecraft, one thing that could be defined as a novel, a short novel, plus a good length novella in Mountains of Madness. And so possibly, I mean, or maybe, I'm not sure, I think it's too long, but The Dream Quest of Kadash is a pretty good, it's very different to normal Lovecraft, isn't it? So that's what I'd be thinking for Wolfe, Tolkien, and Lovecraft, who do seem like good candidates for short story reading. Maybe Bradbury is another one for short story reading, partly because a bunch of his novels are just fix-ups of short stories. So Martian Chronicles, reviewed on this channel, and I think Dandelion Wine is a fix-up. of stories as well, or a part fix up of stories, which I've also reviewed on this channel. And he has other, in terms of, though obviously tending more towards the ghost story and occasional light horror in stuff like October Country, or what's the other one that I've got, which I haven't read, but which has a sort of Tim Burton-esque thing where there's like some Halloween-y avatar who, if you want to rescue your friend's soul, he takes these kids to go and rescue their friend's soul, and there's stories along the way. I'd have to think. Yeah, it's very very good, and I think, as I say, I think it's self-revealing because I think it's Tolkien telling you part of his own process, and I think that the niggle is, in that sense, maybe read as a bit of a joke at his own expense, which doesn't seem very Tolkienian, but it is a joke, so it has to be a joke about something. Um, I think there are some other. I mean, if you get, because it's only a slim volume of his fairy stories, if you get them, there are some other good things in them. Do you know what's also worth? This is more a YouTube thing. Get Tolkien reading the Ballad of Tom Bombadil. That is a really fun experience. Obviously, this is a Tom Bombadil appreciating channel. No substitutes should be accepted. But it uses some sections of these songs from the Lord of the Rings, but is actually brand new, and it's about the Bombadil subduing the wood and coming to marry the river woman's daughter, and about their wedding feast. It's wonderful, and him reading it, you get the sense that though he is not Tom Bombadil, perhaps Lewis is, there is a Bombadilian spirit in him. Roy, I definitely recommend getting it. I got it in, I think it's available in lots of forms, and almost certainly, if nothing else, you can get it on Kindle or whatever, in PDF or EPUB, very, very cheap. I got it, I think Amazon have it pod, in the Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, which we did on the Discord, which we need to get you a link for. We did read the 3 archipelago themed stories in that collection, which was a fun read. It's Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories is, for a wolf story, it's short and it's open, which some people, I think, aren't as into in terms of $12 feels like a lot on Kindle, but I guess if it's that Amazon are the people, who have it print on demand, they've got the rights to the printing or something. Maybe they feel like they can gouge you on the EPUB as well. I don't know. I mean, $12 for a book is fine, isn't it? I don't know. I certainly enjoyed. I prefer hard copy. I'm a Luddite, perhaps influenced by people like Dr. Kirk. But yeah, I think some Wolf fans dislike the more open stuff. We've talked about this, I think, a bit, Matthew. But I really like, for instance, Pandora by Holly Hollander and Castleview, both of which are definitely more open. Mark Aramini has good essays on both of them as well, in terms of exploring some of that stuff. But they're both more open than, say, you read the Book of the New Sun, you're talking about 4 or 5 books worth of stuff, including some, even amongst the hardcore community, and even ignoring the total cranks, more or less unresolved issues, things which there really are. I don't mean just unresolved like who don't agree. I mean unresolved like it's hard to even get the terms of reference, whereas at least with the murder mystery in Pandora by Holly Hollander, that you can get the terms of reference. And I think Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, and we talked about this at the time, does basically let you say, okay, it seems like these are the terms of reference, it seems like these are the possibilities. What's the most compelling way of understanding this? And because he's a good writer, he has very good writing habits. It's it's an easy read as well. I knocked through that one in 20 minutes or so. Yes, I think his stock is on the rise. Not in the sense that, do you know what? I saw one of the biggest booktube channels, a good channel actually as well, did recently review the Vorkosigan saga novel by Lois McMaster Bujold, and I was like, wow. Given that you're talking about the most successful non-retro Hugo'd author ever, if you're in terms of nominations, and possibly I think she's the highest winner as well in terms of number of wins after Heinlein. So ignoring Heinlein, who has 6 wins and the most nominations, including retros, it comes Bujold. Bujold, who's a great writer, is drastically neglected. But that's something that I think is going to push her stock up. Glad to have my American trade paperback omnibuses already. Wolf, what you see is people chatting about how the Book of the New Sun is really important. And you see like, I don't even know, lithub.net or whatever, like slightly low grade book websites coming up with articles about how the Book of the New Sun is really interesting, or how Gene Wolfe invented Pringles and he's a weird guy. And that's interesting, but I don't see that turning into people talking about reading the books outside of r/Wolf. So I think we're a step back from a real Wolfe renaissance, but Wolfe, I think, basically is going to be a writer who stays the course. I mean, by that I mean as in he's an all-time writer of the English novel, and so it's hard to see how it's not going to rise. And because you're never going to hit this, is the thing, the same problem with Kirk actually to a degree, where there's been some small resurgence and interest in his work in the last few years. There are some books that you can easily get, like The Conservative Mind, but plenty of others you're like, okay, you've got to hunt these a bit. And with Wolfe, I think there's a similar thing. Incidentally, both of them Roman Catholics. There's an interesting thing, I think, with Wolfe, that he'll be popular enough that the books get more expensive, but only Book of the New Sun and Earth and Long Sun, maybe. I'm basically Solar Cycle and Fifth Head are likely to be kept in print properly. I mean, I bought fairly recently, and not at insane prices, but there were some insane prices, Sorcerer's House and Pirate Freedom in hardback. As far as I can tell, no UK paperback availability whatsoever. And you think people are going to be looking for those, especially because those two, as examples, are well-recommended late novels. I should maybe get the Borrowed Man duology before it goes crazy. I'm strong on his early novels, not all of them, but I've got a lot of his early novels now, or early to mid novels. It's more his late period that I don't have, and the very earliest couple, Devil in the Forest and Operation Aries, I don't have. But yes, I think it's good. It can only be good. He's a great writer, and if this somehow tricks people into doing a print of Pirate Freedom that won't sell out, that's probably only good for the rest of the world. Yeah. I'm going to be, I did cheat. I'm not actually reading it at the moment. I'm reading LA Confidential by James Elroy, third in the LA Quartet, which is a very good quartet. I got into it because I saw the film LA Confidential and thought this is incredible. And I'm finishing the Shano trilogy by David Gemmell. But I did cheat and start reading only a few pages of On Blues Waters yesterday. And there's that and Peace are my next Wolfe novels coming up, and I might read On Blues Waters first and then go to Peace. I don't know if I should just drive through Short Sun or whether I should put Peace in between. But Peace, by the way, is another often recommended starting point for Wolfe that I haven't read, so people will have to take their own view on that, but is widely recommended as I think is self-contained, like Fifth Head of Cerberus. It's a self-contained novel, individual novel, and some of the things going on are fairly open to interrogation. But yeah, I'll be reading that, and it's tough. I think I know with Short Sun it's going to be challenging in some ways. I'm told, Matthew, I don't know what you think, but I'm hyped for finding, basically seeing how it all concludes. Raymond Feist. I'm trying to. Is Feist Rift War? Is Feist Rift War? I've not read much. I've read in the Legends novella collection. I've read something by Feist. Yeah, I mean, I'll take it that way then. Yeah, it'd be up for. I mean, it's a long single novel if it is that. If you think Wizard Knight terms is 900 pages, which is a long single novel, if you see it in that way, and I think it's probably just over that maybe in combined page count. I've got the original UK. I mean, basically whatever they're still selling, not original from the early noughties, but original from the paperback publication in the UK or whatever. Yeah, I've got one Raymond Feist novel as well as this novella that I've read, and I haven't read the novel. It is also one of my two Janny Wirtz novels because it is Daughter of the Empire, whatever. It's the first in that series. I also have Curse of the Mistwraith, which I know she will pop in later on playback. But I think our friend Prometer, likes. Am I right? Curse of the Mistwraith. And I know there's been a bit of a resurgence in Janny Wirtz stocks recently, but Feist. I wonder if people like Feist like Silverberg, maybe like Stephen Donaldson actually as well. And Johnson is a different author to those two, I grant, different kind of author. I still cannot completely conclude what I think about the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, and I've read 6 of them plus a novella outtake of them. And I own 2 more of them. I don't know. That's a lot of books. That's more than I read of Wheel of Time, and I knew what I thought about Wheel of Time. But yeah, I wonder if you're looking at a lot of quite able authors who are frankly more able than a lot of popular authors now, but who coming up through the late new wave, the late early new wave, is that right? By that I mean really into the early 70s, into the epic post-Tolkien, and were never quite as bingeable as Shannara or whatever, but did very well for a time. And I wonder if, and in some cases also were, you had much more sci-fi themed stuff, so it's always a bit more. Sci-fi has always been, for that brand of stuff, more niche. And I wonder if there's, and I think this maybe applies to Boujard too, actually. I wonder if there's an unfashionability going on there to do with our tastes in the way that epic fantasy series work, and the kind of sci-fi that has been in more recently. I mean, that is that I greatly value r/Wolf, but obviously you can take or leave some of the commentary, and certainly that would not be the impression I'd got from that. However, great. I mean, Wizard Knight I didn't find impossible. I think it's something where it was interesting seeing, as with it's a bit like with Severian and New Sun, and indeed, to be fair, a lot of Wolf novels, there is a niche, there is a group of people who are very good, very able, and very capable of understanding the main characters as sociopathic villains. And I think that's one thing I don't see with Wizard Knight. But beyond that, there are some things that are fiddly, and certainly a lot of the references are fiddly. But I thought I liked the Arthurian stuff. It was good for me. So, Empire of the Damned, who's that by? Is that Mark Lawrence? That's not Mark Lawrence, is it? Red Rising, I kind of occasionally think maybe I should get into Pierce Brown, is that his name? Is that him? Yeah. But that I'm certainly have heard about, and it seems like there's some degree of heroic space opera in it. Is that right? Maybe it's complex but heroic, and I'm up for that. But I mean, equally, I think this is one thing I have this may be a limitation of me, but a limited amount of time I can spend on stuff that is I find grim, which is why I'm, yeah. Oh yeah, Empire is J. Christoph. Is that, yeah? Not read any of that, and it's never from. Maybe I just need to some things. I realize I have heard some people mention this loads of times in vlogs or something, but I haven't actually watched a review, so I don't really know what it's about. So maybe I should do that. Read the Thomas Covenant. Yes, he is the leper. Yeah, it's a. There is an obvious thing. I feel like, Matthew, you must have read some Thomas Covenant at some point. It feels like it. I think Thomas Covenant, like The Dark Tower by Stephen King, is a really interesting response to Lord of the Rings, a really worthwhile one. It's much more interesting than, I mean, if you want, Shannara is the pop response, and no criticism of Shannara, but like just to say that's the pop response, and then Wheel of Time comes a little bit later actually, and is the sort of mass market fantasy, like epic fantasy response. And I think Thomas Covenant and Dark Tower are two different weird responses. And Thomas Covenant is not just what's complex is not just that he's often a dislikable character. He is, and he's meant to be, and that's not bad necessarily. But there's the whole thing, like the number of weird words that Donaldson uses, the number of weird constructions he uses, all the thing that all these kind of weird habits are both very alienating and weirdly compelling. And there is, I mean, I admire him as a writer. I've read, as I say, read 6 books of his plus a out like cut out novella, and I'm up for reading the Last Covenant, the Last Chronicles. Can I remember loads of what happens in them other than it's all weird and everyone's very angsty? That's one thing. It's very, very concept metal, maybe, is the big to say. Yeah, I mean, I'll look into J. Christoph then. That's, you know, good enough for me. Good enough recommendation. I mean, you probably bounced off because the villain's the protagonist starts out as a bad dude or an annoying dude, and you've never found such a bombastic writer, basically, in a very specific way. He's really interesting. This is my problem. I'm like, I don't even know if I like it. I don't know if I recommend it. I'd almost need to reread it, and I don't intend to reread it. I intend to read a synopsis and then read the Last Chronicles. But I think there were some incredibly admirable, intense, powerful things. It's just that I think the quotient of misery is quite high, and that's not massively my jam. Yeah, watched the first season and a bit of Shannara, the show. Feel like I've looked at, is it, I don't know what the first one is. Elfstones? Is it Sword of Shannara? Is it Elfstones of Shannara or whatever? But I don't think I finished it. This is like a long time ago. But people genuinely say, people who who are into a lot of serious, heavy fantasy are like, yeah, there's some good stuff in it, or I like this bit, but not that bit. I think you can see that it has some sort of organic, real passion to it, but my understanding is it's very, very derivative of Lord of the Rings. There's an interesting thing that its setting and the way, like, it's set on a kind of version of Earth is interesting. I'll put it that way. And the series is fun. I think it's kind of bad, but it's got enough fun things in it that it's watchable, in my view. That was my experience of it. I am, because it is past bedtime, I'm gonna go now, and yeah, I guess we'll be back in 3 or 4 weeks to read some Gene Wolfe. Yes, as I say, hey, if you can find an affordable copy, whether EPUB or hard copy, go for it. The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, sometimes collected into the wonderfully named Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories and Other Stories. And the Flogged Horse of Shannara, was that the third trilogy's name? I don't remember. It definitely is a yeah. I'm not sure. My impression is it didn't need to keep going beyond whatever first flush of energy it had, but people do like it, so I'm not going to gainsay them without reading it. Okay, then I will go, and thanks for tuning in. We've had a nice cross section of people, get some good discussion and questions, and I will catch people next time. Night night.